Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 8, Lesson 2. All right, so today we're going to start talking about philosophy a little bit more and the different philosophers in the ancient Greek times. So, one is remember, a philosopher is someone who's, it means, right? The Greek word means love of wisdom. So, they're all about learning about learning, okay? And so there's one group called the Sophists, and the Sophists are philosophers, but they go around and they're teaching different subjects. They went from different polis to polis, teaching math and science and history, but the thing they're most famous for is teaching rhetoric. And rhetoric means the art of public speaking and debate. These particular philosophers did not believe that gods influenced what humans did. And so that's a very different take on things than most Greek beliefs at this time. And they also didn't believe there was any absolute right or wrong. So what's right for one person or seems wrong for someone else might be okay for someone else. So there's definitely some challenging going on of different beliefs in Greek times. Also, they accepted money for their teaching, which other philosophers thought that was kind of like made them seem like they're not doing it for like the pure learning and looking for true, you don't have a true love for wisdom, you're just trying to make money. So that like they saw that as like them having less values, basically. They also criticized them because they thought that they taught students to win arguments rather than looking for the truth. Okay. So one of the major critics of the Sophists was Socrates. Socrates was a sculptor by trade, but he was obviously very interested in philosophy and would go and teach others what his ideas were. He actually did not write down any of his ideas, but his students did. So we know what he thought, even though he himself never wrote it down. One of the things that Socrates is known for is what comes to be called the Socratic method, which is instead of lecturing, you ask pointed questions and ask your students to think for themselves and try to figure out the truth that way. That's a very popular method still used today by a lot of university professors. And the goal is to have people kind of form your own opinions and come to conclusions for yourself. Okay. Socrates got, unfortunately, in trouble with because he was very popular with the young people and he was encouraging them to, think for themselves. That was seen as dangerous in this time. You have to kind of understand that the period of time we're in Athens. Unfortunately, after the Peloponnesian War, when things were really bad, they started making some. It wasn't okay to like publicly question your leaders, and that's a shift, right? And he believed that you should be able to publicly question your leaders, and that's your, freedom, and you're able to think for yourself. And so they didn't like that he was telling people to question authority, basically. And so he was charged and actually found guilty. And what's interesting is that he was sentenced to death by poison, or he could leave forever. And he chose the death. And he made a very famous last speech saying, basically, he's living under the city's rules and laws, so he has to obey them. And so it seems like he was, almost kind of like a martyr, right? Like willing to die for his cause. And, or maybe he just couldn't bear the thought of, never being a full citizen in Athens ever again, right? Being some outsider in another place. Who knows? But anyway, he did choose to drink the poison and he died. All right. One of his students was Plato. Plato goes on to be a famous philosopher in his own right. He did write his own ideas down. He started a school called the Academy, and he also wrote down his ideas in the Republic. The Republic was his idea for what a perfect society and government should look like. It was very interesting. He thought there should be basically all people would be split into three different groups. Um, he thought that the leaders should be these philosopher kings. Okay, so people that have been trained in philosophy and that were very intelligent and well educated, and they thought that those people, being of that like higher mind, would put the needs of the community above their own needs. So they would then, govern well and have the right to govern. And then, of course, you need warriors to, defend and protect your polis. And then there's everyone else. Basically, everyone else, you should contribute to society with whatever skills you have and basically help everyone else. So, like, produce the food and the clothing and things like that, because you don't have the wisdom to be a king or the courage to be a warrior. So, everyone else is lumped together to provide for everyone else. He actually was a big critic of democracy. He didn't think the common people could think for themselves and that they were easily influenced by outside people and they could make foolish decisions. I have to say, I thought of Plato in the last few years, right? Like, are people too easily influenced? And then, democracy goes awry, right? Like, we've been talking about some of these ideas that have been floated and how people seems to not understand what's true and what's not. So anyway, so that's what major belief of Plato's is that's his big criticism of democracy. And even though he was critical of like the common people or whatever, he did think that women should be educated and have the right to have jobs and things like men. So he was a proponent of that. Okay, and another famous philosopher was Aristotle. Aristotle also wrote a lot, and we have quite a lot, like 200 works or something, about all different topics: government, astronomy, political science. He taught it actually at Plato's Academy and taught Alexander the Great, which we'll talk about him again. And he had a lot of interesting ideas. One of his famous ones is the golden mean. From mean from math means like the middle, right? And so he thought he was applying that to like life, that you should live moderately. So don't pig out, eating too much, but also you can't starve yourself. So there's like a healthy middle. And he thought that could be applied to like everything. Like, don't sleep all day, but don't not sleep enough, right? So he really thought that should be kind of applied to everything. He also did a lot for science. He was very careful to study and write down his observations. There's a lot of records he took of all the stars and planets and animals, and he did a lot of recording of his observations, and then decided, he could make some classifications. And so we get that idea of classifying living things according to their similarities and differences actually from him. And so that, of course, got picked up. And that idea, some of his methods are really important for future modern science today. Okay. He also wrote a book called Politics, obviously about government. And he said that he thought the best government would be a combination of all of the three that we've been talking about, right? Monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, which is interesting because that is pretty much what we have today, right? So a monarchy, remember, is a rule by one person. So we have, instead of a king, right, we have a chief executive. That's someone who's like the head of state. So that would be our president, right? Then he thought there should be some kind of council or legislature and it would be supported by the people. So in our sense, that would be Congress, right? That we elect leaders to go make our laws for us. And then he thought there, of course, should be that democratic, like the people should have a say in, and which we do, right? So, interestingly, his ideas are going on to influence Europeans later, and then, of course, eventually Americans. And so, a lot of governments are actually shaped after these ideas. And of course, his writing was about that if it's a combination of these things, it makes it so one person or one group doesn't have too much power, which is exactly why we adopted that, right? And so you see, there is, even though this is so ancient, the ideas having such widespread influence. Okay, and then the other thing we're going to talk about is historians. So historians, interestingly, they remember we talked about how the Greeks believed all the legends and myths and things were true. Okay, so that starts to change in around 435 BC with Herodotus. Herodotus wrote that he thought the gods did play a role, but he was, so he wasn't totally against what they believed at the time. However, he did think that you need to try to separate the facts from the fiction. So he acted like a news reporter. He would question people and try to investigate the truthfulness of the sources. And so because he did that research more, he's nicknamed the father of history, because he's starting, when he wrote his history of the Persian Wars, he didn't just accept everything, all the, myths and things. He did try to, get a careful research behind it. Although he, like I said, he still did believe that the gods had a say. All right, and then Thucydides is also another historian, and he goes a little step further. He was a general in the Peloponnesian War, and he wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, and he went a little further. He's away from those ancient ideas. He thinks that gods don't actually influence what's happening, and that it's people who are making the history. And so he also went around like a reporter. He visited battle sites and examined documents, and he would only accept it an eyewitness account. He wouldn't let any hearsay, like third party or whatever. He would only write it and record it if it was a eyewitness account of something. And he went also another step further in that he not only just recorded the history, but he was trying to write kind of an analysis of the history, exploring causes and effects, and trying to like kind of give warnings to the future generations so you could learn from the mistakes. So it's kind of a shift in what history writing was about during this time period. Okay, and then science, of course, we always talk about the contributions of a society to science. Here's some of the, Thales was one of the famous ones. He was looking for natural explanations. Okay, again, shifting away from the gods controlled all things in nature. He's trying to use science to explain what could have caused something, right? Instead of just saying the gods did it. So that's a big shift, especially at this time period, right? He was in around the 600s where we are. He studied astronomy and mathematics. He also, right, of course, doesn't have modern telescopes and instruments and things, even though, and he's still figuring out how things are working by recording all his observations. So it's pretty impressive. Pythagoras, of course, you probably know the Pythagorean theorem, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. We still use that in geometry today, right? Lengths of the sides of a triangle, if you don't remember. Pythagoras thought that you could see a pattern in numbers and music and basically everything. And so he did a lot to, of course, further our understanding. And it is true that you can find a lot of these patterns. So it's really interesting. We owe a lot to him. And of course, we still use a lot of his ideas today. All right. And then also in medicine, there's a big contribution for the ancient Greeks. You've probably, I'm sure, have heard of the Hippocratic Oath. It's on television all the time and things, right? Hippocrates was called the father of medicine because, again, he is changing the idea that, it's not evil spirits that are causing these diseases. There's actually some kind of natural cause that you can investigate. So he would travel all over Greece and help people and trying to diagnose different illnesses. And he came up with his own treatments. And he came up with this idea that all doctors should, um, try to protect the patient, and do their best to help them no matter what or who they are. So that's part of the Hippocratic Oath. The doctors take that oath to help people. And they also protect. Nowadays, we talk about a lot when we talked about your privacy. Patient's privacy is a big thing nowadays. So, anyway, these ideas, all from the ancient Greeks.